is a character who may be unfamiliar to those who haven't watched Thomas in recent years. She is not from the original Railway series books, but rather a creation of the television series. Rosie made her debut in Season 10, and unlike most of that era's new characters, she actually stuck around for the long haul, eventually receiving a new livery right before Cinders and Ashes hit the fan. As a character, there really isn't much to her. Her initial appearance portrayed her as being overly obsessed with Thomas to the point that she copied his behavior.
She tried to wish the way he did. She even tried to whistle like Thomas.
This aspect of her personality was quietly phased out as she faded into the background for most of the show, only making significant appearances a few times afterward. There is, however, a lot of potential in an engine of her class being on Sodor, which Season 10's writers most likely didn't even recognize. Rosie is based on the S-100 class of the United States Army Transportation Corps, a locomotive that was designed for use across war-torn Europe, but also found buyers back home. The Southern Railway bought 15 of these engines after the end of World War II for use at Southampton Docks, which is where they worked alongside Thomas's basis, the London, Brighton, and South Coast Railway, E2. I knew long ago that somehow I was going to find a way to incorporate Rosie into my Railway series headcanon. To do that, though, she was going to need a more detailed origin. In late 1966, the Fat Controller was preparing to reopen the Arlesburg branch of the Northwestern Railway, and Duck was poised to take charge of passenger duties. Knowing Tidmouth would soon need a new station pilot, he began to look into tank engines that would fit his needs. He passed on the idea of a diesel shunter, seeking to preserve at least one more class of steam engine, but he also wanted a strong class with a short wheelbase that could help out at the docks when needed. His search led him to the port of Southampton, whose military surplus Yank tanks, as the crews called them, were being supplanted by newer Class 7s. He ventured there himself to see them in action, and was most impressed with the work ethic of number 30061. Rosie, as the others called her, had developed a deep kinship with the E2s that used to work there, who told her stories they'd heard of their brother Thomas. She jumped at the opportunity to venture to Sodor and meet him, and in 1967 she ventured by rail to Tidmouth. Duck showed her the ropes of pilot duty before departing for the Little Western, and for the next several years she worked hard pushing and pulling coaches for the mainline engines. That would change in 1974, when plans were approved to extend the Farker branch east towards Ulfstead. Rosie was moved to the branch to help out with the construction, and it was at this point that she and Thomas actually began to spend significant amounts of time together. Thomas, of course, doesn't venture to the big station often, being mostly confined to his branch line, and thus had never really gotten to know Rosie. He didn't like her overly peppy attitude at first, and thought her a bit clingy, and things only got worse when he thought the Fat Controller was going to give the line to her. But eventually, as things go on the Northwestern, the two warmed up after a few escapades, and it is on the branch line that Rosie has remained since. I'm gonna be completely honest, Rosie was probably the easiest Thomas character to model in HO scale. River Rossi made an S100 in both their American and European ranges, and I found one at a local train store for less than what it was going for online. In hindsight, a European example probably would have been a more accurate base, but I was not willing to spend the money to import one at the time I bought mine. Regardless, I had the model, and it's a pretty good one. It's a smooth runner, and it's DCC ready out of the box. I purchased a Digitrax DZ126IN decoder for her, programmed it, and she was ready to roll. Disassembly was tedious due to the amount of small details like handrails. I saved most of these to add back later on, and that does include the bell. It's far from prototypical, but otherwise there'd just be a big hole in the boiler. I'm just gonna pretend the NWR added that themselves when Rosie was moved to the branch line. Now, my original plan was to replicate her Season 21 livery to a T. My original color choices were Cherry Cobbler for the main coat, and Burgundy for the second tone, both from a brand called Craftsmart, and I would paint the lining in white after both of these had been applied. However, this wouldn't work out for various reasons. The first being that this brand of paint is just plain crap. I bought a lot of these for 99 cents a pop at Michael's several years ago, and I do mean several years ago. In terms of modeling, I was just a baby at that point. While they are acrylic paints, they're acrylic paints that cost just $1 for 2 ounces. And you really do get what you pay for. Even after being thinned, they dry too quickly, keep clogging the nozzle, and the finish is abysmal. Couple that with my lackluster masking for the two-tone look and you have yourself a disaster. The base color I chose wasn't even that close to the show. I realized I was going to have to make some changes and went paint shopping again. This time I purchased dark red from Vallejo's Mecha color line. I went back and forth for a while on whether I would try the two-tone paint scheme again, but ultimately decided that it wasn't worth it, and the single paint color would be much more consistent with the other NWR liveries. Thus, I sanded down the surfaces, masked off the smokebox yet again, and gave it a few coats, and this time, it was sublime. I knew now that painted lining was not going to work out whatsoever. Fortunately, I was directed to an easy solution. Fox Transfers makes waterslide decal lining in varying thicknesses. This would be far easier to apply as long as I didn't make it fold back on itself in the process. After some careful measurements, I decided that .35mm lining would look the best, and promptly ordered a sheet. Before applying the lining, I gave the tanks and cylinders a coat of Liquid Shine, a very glossy top coat from Squadron Products, just to give the decal something smooth to adhere to. I also may have busted the 3D printed buffers while handling the chassis for this. I used calipers to measure how long I wanted each stripe to be before I cut the decals. To make things easier on myself, I cut for both sides with each measurement that I took, starting with the tanks and making my way backward. Normally, I would use a decal softener to help apply the water slides, but I found out that the stuff I was using was actually making the ink come off the decal and leave blotches on the surface. I tried to remove it to no avail, and so this became something I'd have to cover up with weathering. The rest of the lining would be applied with just water. I continued to apply the decals until the cab was fully done, and proceeded to add her number. Like with Toby, I modeled the faces myself in Blender and printed them via Shapeways. While they look fine, I had no idea how I was actually going to mount them onto the smokebox. If I were to just stick them onto the smokebox door, the gap between the smokebox and the face would be egregious. I could try and remove the smokebox door, but this would likely damage the piece more than I wanted. I briefly toyed with the idea of modeling the faces around the door before deciding to just print a new piece with a specialized mounting method. This is what I came up with. This system allows faces to be placed accurately on a 2mm peg and removed and replaced easily for rapid emotional shifts. With all of this done, I gave her a quick coat of matte lacquer and reassembled her. The final step was weathering. This is the first model where I was able to add real coal to the bunker. Yes, real coal. I bought one of those bags of coal they sell as gag gifts on Amazon, and took a hammer to it in a plastic bag, wearing a mask of course so I didn't get the black lung.
Don't try this at home, kids.
After making sure the bunker was completely sealed off so nothing got onto the electronics, I picked out some bits that were appropriately sized and glued them into place. I first used 70% isopropyl alcohol to wet the pieces down and keep them from moving about when I applied the glue. The glue itself is just standard white glue, thinned 1-to-1 with water, and with a couple of drops of dish soap added. This is probably one of my favorite things ever. Nothing beats the look of real coal on a model. And that's Rosie. She came out pretty great, I'd say, especially after all the changes I made halfway through. That being said, I would really like to redo her someday, preferably with a model of an S100 that was actually used in Europe, if not an actual Southern Railway example. Hopefully River Rossi will do another run of these, or another manufacturer will make a quality model of this engine in HO, but I suppose only time will tell. For now, I'm happy, and I have a feeling that she'll be really useful.